Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where the day finally stops asking things from you. Tonight, we're going somewhere that looks beautiful from a distance but feels very different once you step inside it. We're going to the Renaissance. Not the polished Renaissance of museum walls and coffee table books, not the Renaissance of perfect marble bodies and glowing saints and portraits that seem to look directly through time. We're going behind all of that. Behind the gold leaf, behind the chapel door, behind the serious face of the Duke staring out from his portrait as if he never once worried about paying anyone. Tonight we're asking a very plain question. The kind of question history books often step around because it feels almost too ordinary. How did artists actually make money in the Renaissance? Because here is the thing that might surprise you. The Renaissance artist, the painter whose work now hangs in a museum under careful lighting, the sculptor whose marble figure is now guarded by ropes and cameras and silent rooms full of tourists, was usually not sitting alone in a burst of inspiration, waiting for genius to arrive. He was running a business. He was negotiating with clients. He was hiring assistants, buying materials, answering to guild rules, waiting for payment, arguing over deadlines, and sometimes chasing money that had been promised and had not arrived. The world that produced so much beauty was also a world of bills, contracts, taxes, pigments, apprentices, rent, reputation, and debt. Most Renaissance works were not made first and sold later in the way we often imagine art being sold today. They were commissioned, which means someone with money, power, or institutional authority asked for the work, shaped the terms, and paid for it, often while expecting very specific subjects, materials, and results. And I want you to sit with that for a moment because it changes the whole picture. When we stand in front of a Renaissance painting now, we usually ask what the artist was trying to say. But in the 1400s or 1500s, the more practical question was often what the patron had ordered, what the contract required, what the church needed, what the family wanted remembered, what the guild could afford, and what the artist could deliver without losing money. Beauty was not floating above daily life. Beauty was embedded inside daily life. It had a price. It had a deadline. It had a customer. Before we go any further, tell me something if you feel like it. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed, half awake already, with the room dark except for your screen? Are you on a couch after a long day? Are you working late somewhere while this plays softly in the background? I always like imagining the strange little map we make together during these stories. One person listening from a cold room, another from a warm one, someone hearing this over rain, someone else hearing it while the city outside is still moving. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history not as a list of kings and battles, but as a way of stepping into ordinary rooms and understanding how people lived, worked, worried, and survived, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story catches you. When some small detail makes the past feel a little closer than it did before. Now let us begin in a place where art and money met every single day. Imagine Florence in the late 1400s, not as a still image, not as a beautiful skyline under a clean blue sky, but as a noisy working city. The streets are narrow. The air smells of wool, smoke, horse dung, damp stone, frying oil, and river water. Bells mark the hours. Men carry bolts of cloth. Women move between market stalls. Priests pass through the crowd. Apprentices run errands with the nervous urgency of boys who know they will be shouted at if they are late. In one street, metalworkers hammer. In another, leather is being cut. Somewhere nearby, a dyer is working with vats that smell so strong you would want to cross the street. And among all these trades, not above them, not separate from them, are the painters, sculptors, woodcarvers, goldsmiths, architects, and craftsmen whose work we now call Renaissance art. This is important. The Renaissance artist was not yet the modern idea of the artist. He was not automatically seen as a lonely creative genius, whose inner vision mattered more than the demands of the market. That idea would grow stronger over time, especially as certain artists became famous enough to change the terms around themselves. But for much of the Renaissance, the artist belonged to the world of skilled labour. He trained in a workshop. He learned from a master. He prepared panels, ground pigments, mixed glues, copied drawings, painted drapery, assisted with backgrounds, and slowly earned the right to do more difficult work. Many works that we now attach to a famous name came out of workshops where the master, assistants, and apprentices all contributed in some way. Contracts sometimes specified that the master himself had to paint certain important parts, but workshop practice also allowed works emerging from a master's shop to carry his name in a way that does not match our modern idea of single authorship. So when you hear a name like Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Verrocchio, Bellini, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Titian or Dürer, try to imagine not just the hand holding the brush, but the room around that hand. Try to imagine the shelves, the tools, the assistants, the partly finished panels leaning against the wall, the smell of oil, egg, plaster, chalk, wood shavings, and wet pigment. Try to imagine a young apprentice sweeping the floor and watching everything. Try to imagine the master listening to a client explain exactly what he wants, while already calculating how much the blue will cost, how long the gold leaf will take, which assistant can be trusted with the less important figures, and whether the buyer is the kind of man who pays on time. Because that was the first truth of making money as an artist in the Renaissance. You needed someone to pay before the work existed. The buyer might be a prince, a duke, a pope, a cardinal, a bishop, a merchant, a banker, a guild, a confraternity, a monastery, a city government, or a wealthy family trying to secure its name in public memory. These patrons were often much more powerful than the artists they hired, and the work they commissioned reflected not only taste but status, ambition, devotion, and political position. A painting was not just decoration. A chapel fresco, an altarpiece, a portrait, a tomb, a bronze door, or a carved saint could announce who mattered, who belonged, who had money, who had piety, who had lineage, and who expected to be remembered. This is where the story becomes more human than the museum label usually allows. A Renaissance artist made money by entering other people's hopes. He painted the Virgin for a church that wanted to inspire prayer. He painted saints for a guild that wanted its profession honoured. He painted a banker kneeling beside holy figures, because that banker wanted to be seen not only as rich, but as devout. He painted a young bride because her marriage was also an alliance between families. He painted a dead man's tomb because memory had become something that could be shaped in stone. He decorated a palace ceiling because power needed to look permanent. He designed festival decorations that would be admired for a week and then disappear, because even temporary beauty could be useful if the right people saw it. Let us slow down here, because the word patron sounds gentle today. It sounds almost generous, like someone kindly supporting the arts because they believe in beauty. Sometimes that was true. There were patrons who loved art, who took real interest in style, invention, and skill. There were rulers and merchants who enjoyed surrounding themselves with learned men, architects, poets, and painters. But patronage was also a system of control. The patron had money, and money set terms. If a church ordered an altarpiece, the church did not usually say, "Paint whatever is in your heart." It said which holy figures should appear. It said where the work would stand. It might say how much gold should be used. It might say what quality of pigment was acceptable. It might require ultramarine, the expensive blue made from lapis lazuli, because blue was not just blue. Blue could be a statement of expense, honour, and seriousness. It could also say that the patron was not cutting corners before God. The contract mattered because memory mattered and money mattered. Renaissance art could be deeply spiritual but it was also practical enough to be written down in legal language. A contract might lay out the subject, the size, the materials, the delivery date, the payment schedule, and sometimes penalties if the work was late or unsatisfactory. Some agreements specified that the artist must use good colours, or that certain parts could not be left to assistants. This is one of those details that pulls the grand story of art back down to earth. The same painting that now makes visitors whisper in a gallery may have begun as an argument over dimensions, cost, and whether the Virgin's mantle would be painted with the best blue or something cheaper. And yet, this does not make the work less beautiful. I think it makes it more interesting. Because the artist had to make beauty inside limits. He had to satisfy a client, obey expectations, manage costs, and still produce something that might outlive everyone involved. That is a different kind of genius than the one we usually imagine. Not freedom without pressure, but invention under pressure. Not the artist floating outside society, but the artist trying to survive inside it. Picture a painter's shop in Florence early in the morning. The shutters have been opened. Light enters from the street. A panel is being prepared with layers of gesso sanded smooth until it can take paint properly. Someone is grinding pigments with a stone, slowly reducing mineral colour into powder. Someone else is transferring a drawing. A boy is sent to buy oil or eggs or charcoal. An older assistant is painting a section of landscape that the master has already designed. The master may be working on a face because faces matter. Hands matter. The Virgin's face matters. The face of the donor matters even more if the donor is paying to be recognised. In another corner, an apprentice copies a drawing again and again until the movement of the line becomes part of his body. This is not a romantic studio. It is a place of training, production, correction, repetition, and commercial pressure. The money coming into that shop did not arrive in a simple, steady stream. Some commissions paid well, others paid slowly. A famous artist could command better terms, but fame took time, connections, and luck. A young painter might begin with minor work, decorative work, banners, shields, small devotional panels, furniture painting, or assisting in someone else's commission. A sculptor might depend on a workshop that could take on tombs, architectural decoration, carved figures, or restoration work. A goldsmith might make objects that were closer to luxury goods than what we would now separate as fine art. In fact, many famous artists trained first as goldsmiths, because the goldsmith's craft demanded drawing, design, precision, and knowledge of precious materials. The boundaries between art, craft, trade, and business were not as neat as modern museums make them seem. This is why guilds mattered so much. In many Renaissance cities, guilds regulated trades, protected standards, controlled training, and shaped who was allowed to work. A painter was not simply a free individual selling inspiration wherever he pleased. He often belonged to a guild structure or worked within a local system of professional rules. Guilds could also become patrons themselves, commissioning works for churches, public buildings, chapels, meeting halls, or civic spaces. In Florence and other cities, guilds were not minor organisations. They were powerful civic bodies tied to politics, economy, and public identity. Think about what that means for the money. An artist made money not just by being talented, but by being placed correctly inside networks. He needed training. He needed access. He needed a master's reputation if he was young. He needed clients who trusted him. He needed guild permission or membership in many situations. He needed family ties, recommendations, previous work displayed in the right place, and sometimes the approval of men who could make or break a career with a single decision. The Renaissance did not reward talent in a clean, fair, modern way. It rewarded talent when talent met opportunity, patronage, politics, location, and money. There is a detail here that I find grounding. The artist's work was expensive, partly because the materials were expensive, but also because time was expensive. Not in the modern hourly wage sense, but in the sense that every finished work required days, weeks, months, or years of labour from multiple people. A fresco required plaster prepared in sections, painting done while the plaster was still wet, planning that could not simply be improvised on the wall. A large altarpiece required wood, preparation, drawing, gilding, painting, drying, revision, transport, and installation. A marble sculpture required the stone itself, the tools, the workshop, the assistants, the physical labour, and the risk of failure. A mistake in marble was not like a mistake on paper. You could not simply paint over it and pretend it never happened. And then there was the problem of waiting. Waiting for a patron to approve a design. Waiting for materials. Waiting for an instalment of payment. Waiting for a church official to stop changing his mind. Waiting for a wall to be ready. Waiting for a political situation to calm down. Waiting for a court to decide whether it still had money to spend. The artist's life could be full of work and still full of uncertainty. The hand might be steady, the mind inventive, the shop busy, and yet the accounts could still be uncomfortable. We forget this because history keeps the finished object and loses the anxiety around it. Now, let us compare that to how we often speak about Renaissance artists today. We say Leonardo was a genius. We say Michelangelo was a genius. We say Raphael was graceful, Titian was bold, Botticelli was lyrical, Donatello changed sculpture, Brunelleschi changed architecture. These statements are not wrong, but they can make the world too clean. Leonardo wrote letters looking for employment. Michelangelo negotiated fiercely and complained about patrons. Raphael ran a large and productive workshop. Titian built a career partly through courtly relationships and repeat clients. Their art was extraordinary, but their careers were also built through systems of money. They did not escape the economy by being brilliant. They learned how to move through it, fight with it, benefit from it, and sometimes suffer under it. One of the quiet mistakes people make about the Renaissance is imagining that fame worked then the way fame works now. Today an artist's name can be a brand in the modern market, attached to exhibitions, auctions, prints, interviews, and public identity. In the Renaissance, reputation mattered deeply, but it moved through different channels. A finished altarpiece in a major church could be seen by many people. A portrait in a powerful family's palace could lead to another commission. Praise from a respected patron could travel. A court appointment could provide income and prestige. A recommendation could open a door. A failed commission, an unpaid debt, or a quarrel could close one. Reputation was not just admiration, it was business infrastructure. Let us make this even more ordinary. An artist had to eat. His apprentices had to eat. His shop needed space. Tools broke. Pigments ran out. Wood had to be bought. Assistants had to be paid or housed. Family obligations did not pause because a painting was important. If the artist had a wife, children, aging parents, siblings, debts, taxes or legal disputes, all of that sat behind the work too. We tend to imagine creation as something that happens in a pure space, away from daily pressure. But Renaissance art was often made in rooms where someone was keeping accounts, someone was sweeping, someone was bargaining, someone was learning, and someone was worrying whether the patron would pay the next instalment. This is why the question of how artists made money is not a small question. It opens the whole world. It explains why churches are full of art. It explains why wealthy families appear near holy figures. It explains why portraits multiplied as status became something people wanted recorded. It explains why some subjects were repeated again and again. It explains why workshops developed recognizable styles. It explains why apprentices mattered. It explains why some artists travelled from court to court and others stayed rooted in one city. It explains why certain colours, materials and sizes carried meaning. It explains why a beautiful object can also be a receipt, a negotiation, a public statement, and a survival strategy. So tonight we are not going to treat Renaissance artists as floating names in gold frames. We are going to treat them as working people in a world that had room for genius, but did not make life easy for it. We're going to follow the money quietly, not in a cynical way, not to drain the beauty from the art, but to understand how that beauty became possible. We will look at patrons, workshops, church commissions, portraits, guilds, contracts, materials, unpaid bills, court salaries, and the slow transformation of the artist's name into something valuable on its own. Because long before the modern art market, long before auction houses and museum gift shops and posters in dorm rooms, there was a painter standing in a workshop, listening to a client, calculating costs, and hoping that this commission would lead to another. And the first person we need to understand is not the artist at all. It is the person on the other side of the table, the patron, the one with the purse, the chapel, the family name, the political ambition, the fear of death, the desire to be remembered, and the power to turn a skilled hand into a paid career. So imagine that knock at the door, not a dramatic knock. Not the kind that announces danger or romance or some sudden turn in a story. Just 3 firm taps on the wooden frame of a workshop in Florence, or Venice, or Milan, or Mantua, sometime in the late 1400s. Inside, the painter looks up from a panel that is only half prepared. A boy stops grinding pigment. An assistant wipes his hands on a stained apron. The smell in the room is glue, chalk, oil, dust, damp wood, and human labour. And at the door stands the person every artist needed and every artist had reason to fear a little. The patron. Maybe not the patron himself, because the richest men did not always come in person. Maybe it is his steward, his notary, his priest, his secretary, or a trusted servant carrying instructions. But whether the man at the door wears fine wool or plain working clothes, he brings the same thing. Possibility, money, trouble. This is where Renaissance art really begins, not with the brush touching the panel, not with the chisel striking marble, but with a conversation. Someone wants something made. A chapel needs an altarpiece. A merchant wants his family shown in prayer. A guild needs a saint for its meeting place. A ruler wants a room decorated so that anyone who enters understands exactly who holds power there. A widow wants a tomb for her husband. A young bride's family wants a portrait. A monastery wants a fresco. A pope wants Rome to look like the centre of the Christian world again. The artist listens, and while he listens, he's doing several things at once. He's imagining the work. He's measuring the ambition of the client. He's thinking about time. He's thinking about materials. He's thinking about reputation. He's thinking quietly, carefully, about whether this person will actually pay. During the Renaissance, most major works of painting, sculpture, architecture, fresco, and decorative art were made through commission, paid for by rulers, religious institutions, civic bodies, guilds, confraternities, and wealthy private families, not produced independently first, and then placed on an open market in the modern sense. This one fact changes almost everything. It means the artist's income usually depended less on making whatever he wanted, and more on persuading powerful people to trust him with what they wanted. The patron was not simply a buyer. He was the source of the job, the judge of the result, and often the person whose name or family identity would be attached to the finished work long after the artist had left the room. The word patron can sound soft to us now. It can make the relationship seem warm, generous, almost noble. And sometimes there really was affection in it. Some patrons admired artists deeply. Some followed their careers. Some collected drawings, discussed ideas, encouraged experiments, and gave artists the kind of protection that allowed them to attempt something difficult. But the basic structure was not sentimental. The patron had the money. The artist needed the commission. That imbalance shaped the room before anyone spoke. A wealthy patron commissioning a painting, building, or sculpture was announcing taste, education, financial strength, social position, and ambition, so the object was never only an object. It was a public statement, and public statements had to be managed carefully. Let us put ourselves inside one of those meetings. A merchant has come to discuss an altarpiece for a side chapel. He's not a prince, not a duke, not one of the greatest names in the city, but he has money from cloth, banking, spice, wool, or trade. He wants the Virgin and Child at the centre. He wants St. John, because his father was named Giovanni. He wants St. Catherine, because his wife is Caterina. He wants his family coat of arms visible but not vulgar. He wants his dead parents remembered. He wants the work finished by a feast day, because that is when relatives, rivals, and business partners will see it. He says he wants devotion. He does want devotion, but he also wants something else. He wants his family to look established. He wants his success to appear blessed. He wants anyone kneeling in that chapel to understand that his money has entered sacred space and left a mark there. This is one of the great truths of Renaissance patronage. People paid for art because art did things. It honoured God. It beautified churches. It decorated homes. It shaped memory. It softened guilt. It announced rank. It preserved faces. It advertised learning. It converted money into visible permanence. A successful merchant could die. His ledgers could be lost. His business could be absorbed by sons and nephews. His enemies could outlive him. But if his chapel remained, and his painted figure still knelt beside the Virgin in good blue and fine gold, then some part of his claim on the world continued. That was worth paying for. The artist knew this. He knew that beneath the discussion of saints and measurements, there was always a second conversation happening. Who will be seen? Who will be remembered? Who will be praised? Who will appear humble while making sure everyone notices that he could afford humility and expensive colours? Renaissance patrons were often sincere believers. It would be a mistake to treat every devotional image as a cynical display of wealth. But sincerity and display could live together very comfortably. A man could genuinely fear for his soul and still want his coat of arms carved beautifully. A family could believe in the intercession of saints and still choose saints who echoed family names. A guild could honour its patron saint and also remind the city that its trade was essential. The patron at the door therefore brought more than money. He brought a social world that had to be translated into paint, stone, bronze, wood, plaster or gold. And if the artist translated it well, more doors might open. If he misjudged it, the damage could follow him. A painting placed in a public church was an advertisement whether the artist wanted it to be or not. Every passer-by, priest, rival, apprentice and future patron could see the result. In a city where reputation moved by conversation, a single visible commission could build a career. It could also expose weakness, bad drawing, poor likeness, cheap materials, delays, disputes, or obvious workshop shortcuts could become part of what people said when the artist's name came up later. This is why the first meeting mattered. The artist had to read the room, even if the room was only his own workshop and a steward holding notes. He had to understand how much freedom he really had. Some patrons arrived with a general desire and allowed the artist to invent. Others brought a precise program, sometimes shaped by theologians, humanist advisors, family tradition, or previous examples they wanted copied or surpassed. Renaissance contracts could specify subject matter, dimensions, materials, deadlines, payment schedules, and sometimes the quality of expensive pigments or gold leaf to be used. To modernise, that can feel controlling. To a Renaissance patron, it was common sense. If you were paying for costly work, especially work meant for public display, you wanted assurances. If you paid for ultramarine, you did not want some cheaper blue quietly substituted. If you hired a famous master, you did not want the most important faces handed entirely to a boy in the corner of the shop. There is something almost funny about that if you look at it from the side. We imagine the Renaissance as the age when individual genius began to shine more brightly, and that is true in part. But some of that genius had to shine through paperwork. The contract was not the enemy of art. It was one of the tools that made the art possible. It told the painter what he would be paid, told the patron what he could expect, and gave both sides something to argue from when one of them became unhappy, which they often did. Renaissance art was full of splendour, but splendour had administrators. Think about the money itself. A patron might pay in instalments, a portion at the beginning, so materials could be purchased and work begun. Another portion as the work advanced, the remainder when the work was delivered or installed. This sounds reasonable until you imagine the artist's position. He has to buy materials before he is fully paid. He has to feed apprentices. He has to maintain the workshop. He has to keep other projects moving. If one patron delays a payment, the delay spreads through the shop like cold air through a badly sealed window. The assistant waits, the supplier waits, the landlord waits, the artist waits, and while he waits he still has to look respectable enough to attract the next commission. Now picture the patron's position. He is also watching risk. He may not fully trust the artist. He may have seen other commissions drag on for years. He may know that famous men overpromise. He may fear that a painter will accept several jobs at once and give his work to assistants. He may worry that a sculptor will blame the marble, the weather, the quarry, the transport, the assistants, the politics, the Pope, or God himself before admitting the work is late. The patron wants beauty, but he wants control over his expense. The artist wants payment, but he wants room to work. This is the friction at the centre of Renaissance patronage. Both sides need each other. Both sides can disappoint each other, and yet when it worked it could produce astonishing things. The wealthy family gained a chapel, a portrait, a tomb, a palace room, a public image, a statement of devotion or power. The artist gained income, visibility, protection, and sometimes access to a higher level of society than his birth would normally allow. This is one of the strange social movements of the Renaissance. Many artists began as craftsmen, trained in shops, working with their hands in trades that could be regulated like other trades. Painters in early modern Italy were commonly part of a workshop world, closer to artisans than to the later romantic idea of the independent artist, and training involved years of learning materials, copying, preparation, and shop practice. But a successful artist could become familiar with princes, bishops, scholars, bankers, and rulers. He might still have paint under his nails, but he might also be invited into rooms where policy, marriage, war, and inheritance were being discussed over wine. This did not erase class, it complicated it. An artist might be praised as extraordinary, while still being treated as hired labour. A patron might flatter him in one letter, and threaten him in the next. A ruler might call him beloved and still refuse to release funds. A pope might demand miracles and complain about delays. A duke might admire invention but insist that his own nose be made more handsome in a portrait. The artist's status rose during the Renaissance, but it rose unevenly, person by person, city by city, patron by patron. Fame could make a master more independent, but only the very few reached a level where patrons courted them as much as they courted patrons. Most artists lived somewhere in the middle. Skilled, respected, necessary, and vulnerable. They needed a flow of work. The patronage system did not usually provide a secure salary unless the artist entered court service or held an official position. Many artists pieced together income from different kinds of commissions. A painter might make an altarpiece, then a portrait, then designs for festival decorations, then a banner, then a small devotional panel. A sculptor might work on a tomb, carve architectural ornament, produce a relief, supervise assistants, and consult on building projects. The great names we remember often came from this practical world of varied labour. They did not begin by being untouchable, they began by being useful. There was also a geography to money. Florence had its own culture of guilds, merchants, republican politics, and family competition. Venice had maritime wealth, government ceremony, confraternities, and a market tied to trade and spectacle. Rome, especially under ambitious popes, could become a magnet for artists because the papacy had enormous need for visual power. Milan, Mantua, Ferrara, Urbino and other courts offered different opportunities, often more dependent on the taste and politics of ruling families. In the north, artists worked in different systems shaped by courts, cities, print culture, and local devotional markets. The Renaissance was not one marketplace. It was many overlapping economies of image-making. The patron at the door was therefore also a messenger from a particular world. A Florentine merchant did not want exactly what a Venetian confraternity wanted. A pope did not want what a small parish wanted. A duke commissioning a portrait of himself in armour was not asking the same thing as a mother commissioning a small devotional image for private prayer. The artist had to understand these differences. He had to know when grandeur was required and when restraint was safer. He had to know when to show wealth and when to disguise it as piety. He had to know how to flatter without making flattery ridiculous. Portraits make this especially clear. When a patron paid for a portrait, he was not only buying a likeness, he was buying an argument about himself. Look at me as I wish to be known. Look at my sobriety, my authority, my learning, my purity, my marriage, my dynasty, my office, my discipline, my youth, my dignity, my wealth that is visible but not vulgar, my power that does not need to shout because the painter knows how to make it sit quietly in the room. A portrait could present a banker as controlled and respectable, a bride as virtuous and valuable, a ruler as strong and legitimate, a scholar as thoughtful, a child as heir. The artist made money by understanding that a face was never just a face. Religious commissions had their own negotiations. A church wanted images that fit doctrine, devotion, location, and use. An altarpiece was not simply admired like a museum painting. It functioned within worship. People prayed before it. Priests celebrated Mass near it. Candles burned beside it. The image had to speak clearly to viewers who might not read Latin or theological texts, but who understood gestures, saints, symbols, wounds, halos, robes, and expressions. A patron paying for such an image was buying participation in that devotional world. The artist had to make something beautiful but also legible. A confused saint, an improper arrangement, or an overly strange invention could cause trouble. This is one reason the patron did not always come alone. He might bring a confessor, a learned advisor, a family elder, or a notary. Large commissions were often embedded in networks of approval. Even if the artist had strong ideas, he was not always free to carry them out without consultation. The Renaissance admired invention, but invention still moved through institutions. A chapel belonged to a church, a family name belonged to a lineage, a public statue belonged to a city, a palace decoration belonged to a political image. The artist could innovate, but the work had to survive the judgment of people who had different kinds of authority. There is a small human awkwardness in all this that I think we should not miss. Imagine standing there while a patron explains how he wants his dead father shown among saints. Imagine being asked to make a man look humble and important at the same time. Imagine agreeing that the patron's wife should be included but smaller, because hierarchy has to be visible. Imagine discussing the exact position of a coat of arms in a sacred scene. Imagine promising that the blue will be fine, knowing exactly how expensive fine blue is. Imagine smiling politely while a man who cannot draw tells you how composition should work. Then imagine needing that man's money badly enough to keep smiling. This is not to mock patrons. Many of them were intelligent. Some had excellent taste. Without them, much of Renaissance art would not exist. Patrons paid for risk, scale, materials and time. A large fresco cycle or sculptural program required resources beyond what most artists could supply alone. A patron's ambition could push an artist toward work that would otherwise be impossible. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, the decoration of princely studioli, great tombs, bronze doors, palace frescoes, civic sculptures, and elaborate altarpieces all depended on money concentrated in the hands of institutions and elites. The uncomfortable truth is that inequality helped fund beauty. That does not make the beauty false. It does make the world behind it harder to simplify. The Medici are the famous example, because their name has become almost inseparable from Renaissance Florence. But we should be careful not to turn them into fairy godparents of genius. They were bankers, political operators, family strategists and image makers. Their patronage was part devotion, part taste, part civic positioning, part dynasty, and part power. Supporting artists, architects, philosophers, and religious institutions helped them shape how Florence saw them and how history would remember them. Other families and rulers did the same in their own settings. The Sforza in Milan, the Este in Ferrara, the Gonzaga in Mantua, the Montefeltro in Urbino, the papal court in Rome, Venetian confraternities and state institutions, wealthy merchants across Europe, all used art to turn money into visible order. This is where the door opened wider. The patron is not only an individual, sometimes the patron is a group. A guild might commission an image of its patron saint, not because one man wanted to show off, but because the whole profession wanted representation. A confraternity might pay for a painting or building decoration as an act of collective devotion and public identity. A city government might commission sculpture to speak about justice, liberty, military victory, or civic pride. In these cases, the artist was not pleasing one person, he was pleasing a committee, and anyone who has ever worked for a committee can understand why that might be harder. A committee patron could mean multiple opinions, slower decisions, more formal contracts, more scrutiny, and less emotional loyalty. But it could also mean prestige. A public commission placed an artist before the eyes of the city. A guild image, a civic sculpture, a church fresco, a chapel decoration, all created visibility that private work could not always provide. For an ambitious artist, a powerful institutional patron was both opportunity and test. If the work succeeded, it could make his name. If it stalled, the whole city might know. We often talk about patronage as if the artist simply received money and produced art. But the relationship could run in both directions. The artist also gave the patron something money alone could not make. A rich man could buy pigment, marble, gold, wood, plaster, and labour. He could not buy talent in bulk. He needed a hand, a mind, a reputation capable of turning expense into meaning. Without the artist, the patron's ambition stayed ordinary. With the artist, it became visible, persuasive, memorable. This is why the relationship was not simple servitude, even when unequal. It was dependency on both sides. The patron needed the artist to make power beautiful. The artist needed the patron to make skill profitable, and there were moments when artists used that dependency. A master with rising fame could negotiate better pay, seek better patrons, delay work, demand materials, or move to another city. He could cultivate several patrons at once. He could write letters praising one potential employer while reminding another of his value. He could let scarcity work for him. Leonardo, for instance, famously presented himself to Ludovico Sforza in Milan not only as a painter, but as a man who could design weapons, bridges, fortifications, and spectacles, because usefulness at court could take many forms. Work for Renaissance artists often came through commissions from churches, states, and private individuals. An artist with court connections could present their abilities broadly, not just as makers of paintings. That broad usefulness mattered because courts were expensive machines of display. A court artist might paint portraits, design costumes, plan festivals, create temporary decorations, advise on architecture, prepare diplomatic gifts, and help construct the public image of the ruler. Some of this work vanished almost as soon as it was made. Festival arches, painted banners, theatrical devices, parade decorations, triumphal displays, wedding ornaments, funeral decorations. They could require enormous skill and long hours, yet leave little trace. For the artist, they could still mean income, access, and favour. Not all money came from masterpieces. Some came from temporary splendour. This is one of the hardest things for modern viewers to accept. The surviving museum object is not the whole career. We see the panel, the fresco, the marble figure, the drawing under glass. We do not see the lost banners, the painted shields, the shop signs, the repairs, the festival designs, the decorative work, the minor commissions, the things made quickly because money was needed. A Renaissance artist's income may have depended on work that no longer exists, and that no museum label will ever mourn because no one preserved it. The famous works survive like islands. The everyday work that kept the shop alive has mostly sunk beneath the waterline. Let us return to the door again, because that is where the tension is clearest. The patron has arrived. The artist knows what this visit could mean. It could mean months of work. It could mean a debt cleared. It could mean a chance to place his name in a church where future clients will see it. It could mean trouble with a demanding family. It could mean expensive materials that the advance payment barely covers. It could mean a deadline that will make everyone in the workshop miserable. It could mean a dispute that ends before a notary. It could mean the beginning of fame. The patron steps inside. He looks around, and he is not only looking at art, he is judging order. Is the shop busy? Are there assistants? Are there unfinished works by recognisable clients? Does the master seem confident? Does he speak well? Does he understand the subject? Does he know how to behave with a man of rank? Skill matters, but presentation matters too. The artist's workshop is a business space, and the patron's confidence is part of what is being sold. The artist shows drawings, perhaps. He may show a small model, a cartoon, a previous work, or a design. Drawings are important here because they allow imagination to become negotiable. The patron can point, the artist can adjust, the saint can be moved, the donor can be added, the coat of arms can be placed elsewhere, the scale can be reduced if the price is too high. The number of figures can grow if ambition takes over. Before paint is applied, the work is already being shaped by money, theology, vanity, memory, and practical limitation. There is a quiet sadness in that, but also a kind of respect. The artist is not merely obeying, he is translating. He takes the patron's desire, which may be confused, boastful, pious, anxious, grieving, competitive, or all of those at once, and turns it into form. He makes the dead visible. He makes status acceptable. He makes fear look devotional. He makes political power look orderly. He makes a family's money kneel before a saint and somehow appear humble while doing it. That is not a small skill. It is social intelligence made visible. And maybe this is why the patronage system, for all its constraints, produced so much that still holds us. The limits were real. Artists could be controlled, underpaid, delayed, insulted, and forced into subjects they might not have chosen. But inside those limits, they learned how to make images that worked on many levels at once. A chapel fresco could be prayer, family monument, civic statement, theological teaching, and advertisement for the artist's shop. A portrait could be likeness, marriage contract, diplomatic tool, inheritance claim, and personal performance. A tomb could be grief, ambition, warning, and hope. The patron paid for one thing and often received several. The modern idea that money corrupts art is too simple for this world. Money shaped Renaissance art. It directed it. It limited it. It also enabled it. Without patrons, the walls would be bare, the chapels plainer, the tombs smaller, the portraits fewer, the workshops thinner, the apprentices less trained, the experiments less likely. Without artists, the patrons would have had money but no lasting image through which to project it. The relationship was uneasy, productive, sometimes exploitative, sometimes affectionate, often practical, and absolutely central. By the time the patron leaves the workshop, perhaps nothing visible has changed. The same panel is leaning against the wall, the same apprentice is grinding pigment, the same assistant is waiting for instruction. But the air has shifted. A price has been discussed, a subject has been named, a deadline has been suggested, a first payment may be promised. The artist may feel relief, anxiety, irritation, pride, or all of them at once. Work is coming, money is coming, or at least money has been promised, which is not the same thing. The shop will have to organise itself around the commission. Materials must be found, drawings must be made, assistants must be assigned, the master must decide what to do himself and what to delegate. And once that decision is made, we step away from the door and deeper into the room, into the place where Renaissance art became daily labour. Not the finished painting in the chapel, not the polished sculpture in the square, but the workshop itself, with its boys, tools, routines, shortcuts, discipline, mess, ambition and noise. Because if the patron brought the money, the workshop turned that money into something visible, and what happened inside those walls was far less solitary, far more practical, and far more crowded than the quiet museum room ever lets on. Thought for 34 seconds, step into the church, but do not picture it the way you would see it now. Quiet, roped off, swept clean for visitors, with a small card on the wall telling you the date and the artist's name. Picture it as a working building in a Renaissance city, full of use, smell, sound, money, anxiety and prayer. The stone floor is uneven. The air is cool even in warm weather. Candles burn in front of painted panels and carved figures. Wax has hardened in ridges near the altar. Incense hangs in the air. Someone is whispering a prayer near a side chapel. A priest is moving near the high altar. A woman has come in with a child. A merchant pauses before the image of a saint whose name he shares. A servant crosses himself quickly before going back into the street. Light enters through high windows and catches on gold leaf, and the gold does exactly what it was paid to do. It glows. It makes the painted world look more stable, more serious, more present than the dim room around it. And somewhere in that glow is the answer to one of the biggest questions in Renaissance art. The church paid. Not always directly, not always alone, not always simply, but again and again, the church was the place where money, devotion, fear, family ambition, public display, and artistic labour met. During the Renaissance, major works of art were commonly commissioned by rulers, religious and civic institutions and wealthy individuals, and altarpieces, frescoes, statues and portraits were among the ways artists made a living inside that system of payment and expectation. This is where we need to be careful, because it would be easy to say something too simple. It would be easy to say that people bought art because they wanted to buy their way into heaven. That sounds sharp, and in some cases it comes close enough to the truth to feel satisfying, but it is not careful enough. Renaissance Christians did not usually think of a painted altarpiece as a simple ticket to paradise. What they were buying was more complicated. They were buying prayers, they were buying remembrance. They were buying a place within sacred space. They were buying masses for the dead. They were buying the visible sign that their family belonged among the respectable and devout. They were buying a kind of spiritual attention, directed toward themselves, their parents, their spouses, their children, and their souls after death. In Florence, churches offered private chapels, burial spaces, indulgences, and private masses in exchange for contributions, and the decoration of these spaces could bring both religious benefits and public status to donors. That's the part that matters. The money was not just handed to an artist because someone liked decoration. The money passed through a belief system in which images, prayers, altars, and memory had practical force. Let us go to a side chapel first, because the side chapel is one of the places where this becomes easiest to see. It may be small, not much larger than a room, set along the wall of a larger church. There is an altar. There may be a tomb slab in the floor. There may be family arms carved or painted somewhere, visible but not always shouting. There is an altarpiece above the altar, and the figures in it have been chosen carefully. The Virgin might be there. Christ might be there. A martyr saint might be there. St. John might be present because the donor's father was named Giovanni. St. Catherine might appear because the donor's wife was Caterina. St. Francis might appear because the family had a special devotion to the Franciscans, or because the chapel sits in a Franciscan church, or because the donor wants to be associated with humility, poverty and penitence, while still paying for something expensive. The National Gallery explains that in Italian Renaissance altarpieces, the central panel often represented the saint to whom an altar was dedicated, while side panels and pilasters could show saints associated with the patron, the church, or local devotion, and even the bases could be reserved for a patron's coat of arms. Now stand there for a moment and look at what that means for the artist. The artist is not simply painting holy figures from imagination. He's arranging a social and spiritual map. The patron's family name, the church's dedication, the altar's use, the saint's story, the feast calendar, the patron's hopes, and the rules of religious imagery all have to fit into one object. The artist may want a balanced composition. The patron may want a certain saint included. The priest may want the image to be clear to worshippers. The family may want the coat of arms visible. The contract may require good gold and expensive colour. The space above the altar may be narrow or wide or divided by architecture. The frame may be carved by another workshop. The payment may come in instalments. And all of this has to produce something that can stand in a sacred place without looking like a business deal, even though it absolutely is one. The altar matters because the altar is not just furniture. It is the place where the Mass is celebrated. In the mind of a Renaissance believer, the Mass is not a symbolic gathering in the modern casual sense. It is the central act of worship. It connects the living and the dead, earth and heaven, visible ritual and invisible grace. When a family endowed an altar or paid for a chapel, they were tying their name to that repeated action. A priest might say Mass there for the soul of the donor after his death. Family members might be buried nearby. The image above the altar helped focus devotion, but it also marked the space as belonging in some sense to that family's memory. So when we ask how artists made money, one answer is that they were paid to give shape to that arrangement. They made the visual setting in which prayers would continue after the patron was gone. This is why death is everywhere in this story, even when the paintings look full of colour and life. Renaissance art often feels alive to us now, because the bodies are carefully modelled, the faces are individualised, the cloth is heavy, the landscapes recede, and the architecture seems believable. But many commissions were haunted by death from the beginning. A man commissions a chapel because he knows he will die. A widow commissions a tomb because her husband has died. Children pay for an altarpiece because a parent is gone and the family must be seen to honour him properly. A confraternity commissions an image because its members want protection in life and prayers in death. The artist is paid to work in a world where the dead are not fully absent. They are remembered in inscriptions, tombs, coats of arms, kneeling donor portraits and masses said at specific altars. Imagine a banker standing with a church official to discuss a chapel. He's wealthy enough to fund the work, but wealth brings its own problems. Lending money at interest could carry moral suspicion in Christian teaching, even while banking was essential to the economy that made many commissions possible. He may want to demonstrate repentance, generosity, and devotion. He may want his family to appear as servants of God, not merely handlers of money. The church needs funds. The artist needs work. The banker needs spiritual reassurance and public respectability. So the chapel becomes the place where all three needs meet. The church receives a decorated sacred space. The artist receives payment. The banker receives memory, status, and the hope that prayers will be offered for him and his family. The finished image may show saints and angels, but behind it stands a very human arrangement of fear, reputation, and accounting. This does not mean the devotion was fake. That is too modern and too cynical. A Renaissance merchant could be sincerely religious and still concerned about his public image. A widow could genuinely grieve and still want a tomb that displayed her husband's rank. A guild could honour its patron saint and still use the image to remind the city that its trade was respectable. Human motives were mixed then, just as they are now. People did not stop wanting status when they entered church. They brought status with them, dressed it in devotion, and placed it near the altar. The artist had to understand that mixture. He had to know how to make a donor appear humble. This is harder than it sounds. In many paintings, donors appear kneeling at the edge of the sacred scene, smaller than the saints, hands joined in prayer, eyes directed toward the holy figures. That posture says, I am not the centre. But the fact that the donor is painted at all says, remember me. The smaller scale says humility. The placement says access. The family arms say identity. The expensive materials say wealth. The prayerful pose says devotion. The entire image is a negotiation between not showing off and making sure no one misses who paid. For an artist, this could be profitable, but it could also be delicate. A patron might want his portrait included in a sacred scene. The artist had to make the likeness recognisable without making it crude or distracting. He had to place a living or recently dead person near holy figures without upsetting the devotional balance. He had to flatter, but in a restrained way. If the donor looked too proud, the image might seem morally awkward. If he looked too plain, the family might be displeased. If his coat of arms was too large, people might whisper. If it was too small, the patron might complain. Sacred art did not remove vanity from the room. It forced vanity to behave itself. The church also created work through scale. A private patron might pay for a single panel, but a church could require a whole visual programme. A chapel might need an altarpiece, frescoes on the walls, painted vaulting, carved ornament. A tomb, a metal grill, candlesticks, vestments, banners, and liturgical objects. Different artists and craftsmen might be involved. A painter might not receive the whole job, but he might receive a valuable part of it. A sculptor might carve a tomb. A woodworker might make the frame. A gilder might apply gold. A metalworker might make candlesticks or reliquaries. The church was not only a patron of painters, it supported a whole ecosystem of skilled labour. This is especially clear when we think about confraternities. These were lay religious associations, often organised around charity, devotion, burial, processions, hospitals, or particular saints. They were not always made up of the richest individuals, but together they could become serious patrons. Confraternities commissioned altarpieces, narrative cycles, statues, processional banners, liturgical and devotional objects, and decorations for chapels, oratories, hospitals, shelters and meeting spaces, using art to honour saints, glorify rituals, publicise good works, and extend artistic patronage to members who could not have paid for such objects alone. This matters because it shows that religious patronage did not come only from popes and princes. It also came from groups of lay people who pooled money, elected officers, maintained rituals, and needed images to hold their identity together. Now picture one of their processions. Members of a confraternity walk through the street in ordered lines. They carry candles, some wear robes. A painted banner moves above them, showing their patron saint, the Virgin, Christ, or a scene connected to their devotional purpose. That banner is not a museum painting. It is handled, carried, exposed to weather, seen by crowds, folded away, brought out again. It may be repaired, repainted, replaced. For the artist, it is work. For the confraternity, it is public identity in motion. For the city, it is religion seen in the street. These kinds of objects remind us that Renaissance artists made money not only from permanent things fixed over altars, but from ritual objects that lived hard-working lives and often did not survive. Inside the church, images also taught. Many worshippers could not read Latin theological texts. Even those who could read did not receive religious meaning only through books. They saw saints identified by attributes, martyrdoms, gestures, wounds, symbols, colours, and stories arranged in paint. A predella, the long lower section of an altarpiece, could show episodes from a saint's life. A fresco cycle could tell a narrative across the walls of a chapel. The placement of figures could connect local devotion with wider Christian story. Painters usually produced religious work to order, and their creativity operated within a system of patronage that imposed restrictions while still allowing invention in how familiar subjects such as the Nativity or crucifixion were represented. This is where the artist earned money through clarity as much as beauty. The image had to be understood. A saint who could not be recognised was a problem. A story that confused the viewer was a problem. A devotional image that looked too strange could fail in its purpose. That does not mean artists were merely obedient. The church gave them subjects, but not every solution. A crucifixion could be crowded or spare. The Virgin could be shown with solemn stillness or human grief. A martyrdom could emphasize suffering, courage, violence, or heavenly reward. A saint could look distant and majestic or almost present in the room. The same basic subject could be repeated for centuries and still remain open to invention. This is part of why religious commissions were so important for artistic development. The themes were known, but the solutions were not fixed. Artists made money by satisfying expectations while finding ways to make the familiar feel newly persuasive. Think of the artist working on an altarpiece for a church. He knows the painting will not be viewed at eye level in a bright gallery. It may be above an altar, seen through candlelight, incense, distance, and movement. People may glimpse it while entering, kneeling, listening, praying, or watching the priest. The gold must catch light. The figures must read clearly. The central saint must be identifiable. The patron's chosen saints must be included without crowding the image. The lower scenes must be small but legible. The frame may be architectural, dividing the image into panels. The work has to function in a real building, not just in the artist's imagination. The price reflects that complexity. It is not simply the price of paint. It includes design, labour, assistance, materials, gold, panels, framing, transport, and installation. It includes the risk of delay. It includes the reputation of the artist. If the artist is famous, the patron is not only buying skill, but also association with that skill. A chapel decorated by a known master reflects well on the donor. A lesser artist might be cheaper, but cheaper art in a public sacred space might suggest lesser devotion or weaker status. Even humility had levels of finish. There were also large church commissions that could dominate an artist's life. Fresco cycles required scaffolding, assistance, careful planning, and coordination with architecture. Tombs required sculptors, masons, inscriptions, and often negotiations over placement. A high altar might require a major altarpiece seen by the whole congregation. A cathedral project could involve generations of artists, each adding to a building that outlived them. For an artist, church work could provide visibility unmatched by private domestic commissions. A painting in a family palace might be seen by guests. A painting in a church could be seen by everyone who entered, from elite patrons to labourers, nuns, priests, pilgrims, children, and foreigners passing through. That visibility made church commissions a form of advertisement. An artist's work placed in a prominent chapel could lead to more work. Someone sees the softness of a face, the richness of the colour, the confidence of the architecture, the dignity of a donor portrait. Later, when his own family needs a chapel painted, he remembers. In a world without modern advertising, churches were among the most important public display spaces for artistic reputation. A successful altarpiece could speak for the shop long after the artist had gone home. But the church could also be a difficult client because the church was not one person. A commission might involve a donor family, a religious order, priests, a building committee, heirs, executors, and sometimes civic authorities. If the donor died before the work was complete, heirs might dispute payment or alter the terms. If a religious community changed priorities, a project could stall. If the design was considered improper, the artist might be forced to revise. If funds ran low, decoration might be delayed. The sacred setting did not make the payment process holy. It made it more complicated. Let us return to the phrase, the price of heaven, because it sounds dramatic, but the real history is more practical than the phrase suggests. A donor could not simply hand an artist a bag of coins and purchase salvation like a market object. Theologically, salvation was not supposed to work that way. But Renaissance religious culture did include practices in which money funded prayers, masses, chapels, burial spaces and indulgences, all connected in different ways to concern for the soul. Churches in Renaissance Florence offered what the NBER study calls salvation aids, including private masses, indulgences and burial spaces, while also benefiting from the prestige and decoration that private chapels brought to the church building. The artist's income came from this system because images were one of the main ways those donations became visible and durable. There is something very human about that. People who feared death wanted structure around that fear. They wanted ritual. They wanted names remembered. They wanted holy figures near them. They wanted the living to pray where they had paid to be buried. They wanted their children to see the family chapel and understand continuity. They wanted their money to become something more respectable than money. Art helped do that. It took wealth, which could look selfish, and turned it into a public act of devotion. A rich man who spent lavishly on clothes or feasts could be criticised. A rich man who decorated a chapel could appear generous, pious, and civic-minded, even if everyone understood that his family name benefited too. The artist stood at the centre of this transformation. He turned coin into colour. He turned anxiety into saints. He turned status into kneeling prayer. He turned a family's fear of being forgotten into a painted presence that might last centuries. And because the church was full of such needs, it provided work again and again. Not every artist became rich from this. Many did not. Some payments were modest. Some commissions were delayed. Some artists had to sue or negotiate or accept less than they hoped. But the religious economy gave artists a constant field of opportunity, because churches, chapels, confraternities, monasteries, convents and donors all needed images. If you stand in that church near evening, when the light begins to fade and the candles matter more, you can almost see the whole arrangement at once. The altar is ready for Mass. The painted saints stand above it. A family coat of arms rests near the base. A donor kneels in paint, forever praying, forever visible. A widow's money may have paid for part of it. A son's inheritance may have completed it. An artist's workshop may have prepared the panel, ground the pigments, gilded the frame, painted the figures, and delivered it under pressure. The priest may say Mass there for the dead. The living may glance at the image without thinking of the contract. A child may remember the gold for the rest of his life. The patron's name may survive because the artist gave it a place to cling. And then, beyond the altar, another form of payment waits. Quieter, but no less powerful. Because not every patron wanted to be remembered beside saints. Some wanted to be remembered by their own face. Not kneeling at the edge of heaven, not hidden in a chapel, but looking outward from a panel dressed in good fabric, holding a glove, a book, a ring, a letter, a child, a symbol of office, a sign of learning, or nothing at all except the expression they hoped would carry them into the future. The church taught artists how money could buy memory, but the portrait made that memory personal, direct, and sometimes uncomfortably honest. Leave the chapel for a while, and let the door close softly behind you. The candles are still burning near the altar, the donor is still kneeling in paint at the edge of the holy scene, and the priest will return to that place again, perhaps tomorrow morning, perhaps before anyone in the city has fully woken. But outside the church another kind of image is waiting, one that does not need saints to explain its purpose, a face, a person looking outward, A man in a black cap, a woman in a red dress, a ruler in armour, a bride in jewels. A merchant standing in a room furnished with careful wealth, a scholar with a book, a child whose family wants the world to know that the line continues. The portrait may seem simple compared with a great altarpiece. It is smaller, quieter, easier to overlook from a distance. But for the Renaissance artist trying to make money, the portrait was one of the most useful, flexible, and socially powerful forms of work available. It gave the artist access to families, courts, marriages, offices, and private rooms. It gave patrons something they wanted very badly. Not just a record of what they looked like, but a controlled version of how they wished to be remembered. That is the first thing to understand about portraits in the Renaissance. They were not just likenesses. A portrait did not merely record a face. It said something about identity, rank, character, presence, and the role the sitter wanted to occupy in the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art puts this plainly when it explains that a portrait does not only show someone's features, but offers a sense of who that person is and gives the viewer the feeling of a real presence. That was valuable. In a world without photography, without newspapers full of printed faces, without passports, video, or family albums, a painted likeness was a serious object. It could travel where the person could not. It could remain after death. It could speak in rooms where the sitter was absent. It could help arrange a marriage, impress an ally, reassure a family, honour an ancestor, advertise dignity, and make a successful man look as if his success had always belonged to him. Now picture the painter receiving this kind of commission. It may not require the scale of a chapel fresco, but it requires a different kind of attention. Patron sits before him, or perhaps sends a family member, a bride, a son, a daughter, a political agent, or a visiting noble. The artist has to watch closely. Not only the length of the nose or the line of the mouth, though those matter. He has to notice posture, tension, clothes, hands, objects, how the sitter wants to be seen, and how far reality may be improved before improvement becomes a lie. This is a dangerous line. A sitter wants a good likeness, but usually not too honest a likeness. Too much truth can offend. Too much flattery can look foolish. The painter is paid to balance recognition with aspiration. The face must belong to the person, but the finished image must belong to the version of the person that family, office, wealth, and ambition can accept. That balance could make portraiture profitable, because it made portrait painters useful. A city full of merchants needs images of merchants. A court full of nobles needs images of nobles. A marriage market needs images of potential brides and grooms. A ruling family needs images of heirs. A scholar wants to be remembered with the tools of thought. A banker wants gravity. A soldier wants courage without brutality. A widow may want sobriety and dignity. A young woman's family may want modesty, beauty, lineage, and wealth all visible at once. The artist who could solve these problems could work steadily. Portraits touched many parts of Renaissance life, including politics, courtship, marriage, childhood, old age, death, friendship, and identity. That meant the demand was not confined to one building or one institution. The portrait moved through households, courts, churches, diplomatic channels, and family networks. Let us begin with a merchant, because merchants explain this world better than kings do at first. A king's portrait is obviously about power. A merchant's portrait is more interesting because it has to make power look earned, controlled, and respectable. Imagine a wealthy man in Bruges, Florence, Venice, or Antwerp. His money comes from trade, banking, cloth, shipping, or finance. He is not a prince. He cannot dress exactly like one without inviting criticism, but he also does not want to look ordinary. He has worked too hard, married too carefully, lent too much, travelled too far, and calculated too well to be remembered as ordinary. So he pays a painter. The painter places him in good clothing, perhaps with fur, a dark robe, a cap, a ring, a book, a letter, a counting table, or a controlled interior. The face is serious. The hands are carefully arranged. The background is not random. Every object has been chosen, because objects in portraits are rarely innocent. This is why Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait remains such a useful example, even though it is a northern painting rather than an Italian one. The National Gallery identifies the sitters as probably Giovanni di Niccolao di Arnolfini, an Italian merchant in Bruges, and his wife standing in a private room surrounded by carefully chosen signs of wealth and social status. The same account points out that the room is not a palace but a wealthy merchant's reception room, with expensive fabric, carved furniture, a brass chandelier, an oriental carpet, and oranges that signalled luxury. That is exactly the point. The portrait is not only saying, here are two people, it is saying, here is a household of means, taste, restraint, and social ambition. The painter is paid to make wealth legible without making it crude. Now imagine how valuable that skill could be. A merchant might not need a large altarpiece every year, but families needed portraits across generations. A father wants his son shown as heir. A husband wants his wife remembered. A bride's family wants her image circulated or preserved. A man entering public office wants a portrait suited to his new status. A scholar wants an image attached to his books, letters, or reputation. A court wants portraits of rulers, queens, princes, and princesses sent across Europe. Each portrait is smaller than a chapel, but together they create a market. The artist who becomes known for likeness, tact, and good finish may find a steady flow of clients, especially if the work can be produced efficiently in a shop. There was also the matter of marriage, and this is where portraiture becomes almost uncomfortably practical. Renaissance marriages among elites were rarely only private romances. They were family arrangements involving dowries, inheritance, territory, political alliance, legitimacy, and status. A portrait could mark an engagement, celebrate a marriage, or help make the match possible before the bride and groom had spent much time together, or sometimes before they had met properly at all. The National Gallery of Art's Renaissance resources explain that portraiture played an important role in forging alliances between powerful families, and that portraits could both mark engagements and help make them possible. That means the painter was not merely producing a sentimental keepsake, he might be making an object that moved through negotiation. Think of the pressure in that. A young woman's portrait might be sent to a prospective husband, court, or family. The image needs to show beauty, but not immodesty. Wealth, but not vulgarity. Fertility suggested through youth and dress, but not openly stated. Family rank through jewels, fabrics, colours, and symbols. A carnation may point toward marriage, pearls may suggest purity. A belt, veil, or gesture may carry meaning. The sitter herself might have little power over the use of her image. Her face travels into rooms where older men discuss alliance, dowry, inheritance, and political advantage. The painter is paid to make her acceptable, desirable, respectable, and useful within that system. For male sitters in marriage arrangements, the problems are different but related. A prospective groom might need to appear stable, wealthy, well-born, controlled, and capable. A prince must look legitimate. A widower must not look weak. A young heir must not look childish, even if he is. A portrait becomes a document of promise. Not legal in itself, usually, but persuasive. Here is the person. Here is the family. Here is the face attached to the negotiation. Here is the image that allows distance to be shortened. In a world where travel could be slow, dangerous, and expensive, portraits helped people make decisions about bodies, families, and futures from far away. The painter could benefit from this because marriage networks were broad. A good portrait might be seen by another court. A successful likeness of a bride could lead to a portrait of her husband, then their child, then her sister, then a diplomatic commission. One family connection could turn into several paid works. Portraiture was intimate, but it was also social advertising. A painting made for a domestic room might travel, be copied, discussed, compared, and remembered. The artist's reputation moved with the face. Court portraiture added another layer. At court, a portrait was never only personal, it was political equipment. A ruler's face had to stand for authority even when the ruler was absent. A portrait could be sent as a diplomatic gift. It could hang in a palace to remind visitors of dynastic continuity. It could present a ruler as warrior, judge, patron, scholar, husband, father, or divinely favoured prince. The artist working at court might earn not just payment for individual pictures, but access, protection, housing, titles, clothing allowances, or salary. This could be more secure than depending entirely on scattered commissions, but it came with obligations. The court artist might be asked for portraits, festival designs, decorations, emblems, temporary spectacles, and images that serve the ruler's public identity. There is a quiet bargain here. The court gives the artist proximity to power. The artist gives the court control over appearance. A ruler may have scars, bad teeth, an aging face, a weak body, or a reputation that needs repair. The portrait cannot erase everything, because a completely false image loses authority. But it can shape the message. Armour can make a nervous man look martial. A hand resting on a book can make him look learned. A column can suggest strength. A curtain can suggest rank. A distant landscape can imply dominion. A calm expression can make power appear natural rather than anxious. The artist is paid to make politics visible on a face. This same logic applied below the level of kings. Clergymen, magistrates, lawyers, ambassadors, physicians, scholars, and wealthy tradesmen all use portraits to place themselves within recognisable social roles. A scholar with a book is not just someone who reads. He is claiming a life of learning. A man with gloves may be showing refinement. A woman's dress may show family resources and marital status. A child may hold a bird, fruit, toy, or flower, each chosen to say something about innocence, hope, lineage, or loss. A portrait of an elderly person may emphasise wisdom and piety. A posthumous portrait may try to recover a face already gone. This is why the artist needed more than technical skill. He needed to understand symbols, costume etiquette, and the unspoken rules of class. The cost of being remembered was not just the artist's fee. It included clothing, setting, materials, and time. Sitters often wore garments selected to display wealth or status. Fine fabrics were expensive, and the artist had to render them convincingly. Fur, velvet, silk, brocade, embroidery, jewellery, gloves, hats, chains, rings, books, carpets, imported fruit, carved furniture, and polished objects were all part of the language of portraiture. Some were owned by the sitter. Some may have been studio props or adjusted by the artist. Either way, they had to look believable. If a patron paid for a portrait that displayed expensive clothing, the painter's skill in rendering texture became part of the value. A badly painted velvet insults the velvet. A dull jewel weakens the claim. A flat hand makes the sitter look less alive. This is where portraiture could be especially good for a painter's reputation. A religious scene could display invention, composition, and devotional feeling. A portrait displayed judgment under pressure. Everyone who knew the sitter could judge the likeness. Everyone who understood status could judge the costume and setting. Everyone who mattered could ask whether the painter had made the person look alive, dignified, and appropriate. A successful portrait could make people say, "He caught him," or "She looks exactly so," or "He made her beautiful without making her false." Those comments mattered. They could bring the next sitter to the door. But portraiture could also expose the artist. If the face was wrong, excuses were limited. A saint's face could be idealised. A donor's face could be adjusted. But a living patron paying for his own portrait could look at the image and decide whether he was pleased. Imagine the discomfort. The painter turns the panel. The patron sees himself. Perhaps he is silent for a moment too long. Perhaps his wife looks first. Perhaps an advisor says the mouth is not right. Perhaps the patron thinks the nose too large, the eyes too tired, the expression too severe, the body too old, the clothing not rich enough, the hand awkward. The artist has to respond carefully because pride is involved, money is involved, future work is involved. A portrait sitter does not want to hear that the painter merely painted what he saw. The artist therefore becomes part craftsman, part observer, part negotiator, and part diplomat. He must flatter without appearing to flatter. He must correct without admitting correction. He must possibly adjust age, complexion, posture, and expression while maintaining credibility. This is not vanity in some shallow modern sense. For the sitter, the portrait may become the image by which descendants know him. It may hang in a family house long after his body's gone. It may be copied for relatives. It may be used in marriage, politics, inheritance, or memory. The sitter is buying a future face. Of course he cares. One of the most important changes during the Renaissance was the growing interest in distinctive individual likeness. The Met notes that after centuries in which more generic representation had often dominated, distinctive portrait likenesses reappeared in 15th century Europe, connected with renewed interest in everyday life, individual identity, and ancient Greco-Roman practices. This does not mean everyone suddenly became modern individuals in the way we might imagine. People still lived inside family, religion, rank, and community. But the face became more important as a specific record. Patrons wanted not only a type, but themselves. Their own nose, their own mouth, their own gaze, corrected perhaps, improved perhaps, but still recognisable. Formats mattered. In 15th century Italy, the profile portrait was common, especially for women and rulers, partly because it echoed ancient coins and medals. It gave the sitter dignity, clarity, and a certain distance. The person does not confront you directly. They are presented almost like a medal, stable and controlled. The three-quarter view, more common in northern painting and later embraced widely, allowed more engagement. The sitter turns slightly toward the viewer. The eyes may meet yours. The body occupies a space that feels closer to real presence. The Met describes both the profile format and the spread of the three-quarter view, which created stronger engagement between sitter and viewer. These were not just artistic choices. They affected how a patron appeared. Profile can make a person seem formal, dynastic, and restrained. Three-quarter view can make the sitter seem present, alert, and psychologically accessible. For artists, knowing these formats meant knowing market expectations. A conservative family may want a profile portrait because it suits marriage display and female decorum. A merchant in the north may want a three-quarter image that shows hands and objects. A ruler may want medals as well as paintings, because metal can circulate and endure. A scholar may want an engraving that can be reproduced. A court may want copies of a ruler's image sent to allies. Each format has its economy. A painted panel may be unique and expensive. A medal can be produced in multiples. A drawing can serve as preparation. A print can spread a likeness more widely. The portrait market was not one thing. It was a set of overlapping ways to turn identity into objects. Portrait medals deserve a moment, because they show how closely memory, power, and reproduction were tied. Inspired by ancient coins, Renaissance medals could carry a ruler's or patron's likeness on one side, and an emblem, motto, or scene on the other. They were smaller than paintings, durable, collectible, and capable of being given as gifts. For a patron, a medal made the face portable. For an artist or medalist, it created another paid specialty in the economy of remembrance. A bronze medal does not have the glow of oil paint or tempera, but it has permanence. It can sit in the hand. It can travel in a box. It can be passed from one person to another as a sign of favour or identity. Women's portraits bring another set of realities, often more restrictive. Many female portraits, especially in marriage contexts, were shaped by expectations of chastity, obedience, beauty, fertility, and family status. The sitter might be richly dressed, but the image often said more about family strategy than personal expression. A young woman's profile, jewelled hair, pale skin, embroidered sleeve, and composed expression could announce marriageability and lineage. Her individuality mattered, but it was filtered through social purpose. That does not make the portraits empty, it makes them complex. Beneath the polished surface is a world of arranged marriage, dowry negotiation, gender expectations, and family ambition. At the same time, portraits could preserve tenderness. Not every image was coldly strategic. Husbands and wives did commission likenesses out of attachment. Parents wanted images of children who might not survive in a world of high mortality. Friends exchanged portraits. Scholars and poets valued likenesses as signs of intellectual community. Lovers kept images. Small portraits could be covered, carried, revealed, protected. A face in paint could be public or private, political or intimate, official or personal. The same form could serve many emotional uses, and each use created work for artists. That range is one reason portraiture became so central to artist earnings. A church commission might be grand but occasional. A court appointment might be prestigious but dependent on favour. Portraits could fill the spaces between larger jobs. They could be scaled up or down, a modest bust-length likeness for a local professional, a more elaborate panel for a wealthy couple, a series of family portraits, a diplomatic portrait sent across borders, a ruler's image copied for officials, a memorial portrait after death, a small likeness for private devotion or affection. The portrait allowed the artist's hand to enter many levels of society. The workshop also adapted to this demand. A master might paint the face and hands, while assistants handled costume, background, or repeated elements. A portrait type could be reused. Copies could be made for relatives or courts. A successful ruler's image might need repetition, and repetition could mean income. The idea of the unique masterpiece is only part of the story. In power politics, likeness often had to circulate. One portrait in one room was useful. Several versions in several places were better. The artist who controlled a reliable image of a ruler or famous patron could gain repeated work from that control. There is also the self-portrait, which changes the money story in a subtle way. When artists painted or drew themselves, they were not always doing it for direct payment. But self-portraits could serve reputation. They declared presence, skill, intellect, and status. An artist showing himself as a thoughtful person rather than a mere manual labourer participated in the broader rise of artistic identity during the Renaissance. If patrons began to see artists as men of mind as well as hand, that could affect payment, access, and respect. The artist's own face became part of the argument that art was not only craft, but a learned and noble practice. Even when not sold immediately, the self-image could help raise the value of the name. By now, the pattern is clear. The portrait made money because people feared disappearance. They feared being forgotten by descendants, overlooked by rivals, misrepresented by enemies, or reduced to a name in a document. A portrait gave them something stronger than a line in a ledger. It gave them presence. It could outlive the body, the clothing, the house, sometimes even the family fortune. That is why patrons paid. Not because paint defeated death, but because it gave memory a face. And the artist knew this every time a sitter entered the room. The commission might begin with ordinary business, the size of the panel, the price, the delivery date, whether the sitter will come again, whether the clothing should be shown as it is or improved, whether the background should include a window, a curtain, a table, a landscape, a symbol, a coat of arms, whether the hands should be visible. Hands cost time, jewellery cost time, velvet costs time, a child costs patience, a ruler costs caution, a bride costs diplomacy. The fee is not simply for likeness. It is for managing all of that without making the finished image look managed. So picture the sitting itself. The room is quiet in a different way from the workshop's usual noise. The patron sits or stands. Perhaps he grows bored. Perhaps the painter studies him, while pretending not to stare too aggressively. Perhaps the first drawing is made. Perhaps the sitter comes back several times. Perhaps the face is done from life and the costume from garments left behind. Perhaps the patron's wife or father comments. Perhaps the artist must remember that the person before him has money, influence, and sensitivity. The painter works carefully, not only because the face matters, but because this face may lead to others. When the portrait is finished, the money changes hands, though not always smoothly, and the object enters another life. It goes to a marriage negotiation, a palace, a family room, a study, a court, a chest, a chapel, a diplomatic packet, a gallery of ancestors. The artist's work has become part of someone's identity. The patron receives memory. The artist receives income, and if the work is admired, the chance of another commission. The face looks outward, still and controlled, while behind it sits the whole machinery of Renaissance money. Family ambition, court politics, marriage alliances, social rank, workshop labour, expensive materials, tactful flattery, and the constant human wish not to vanish completely. But the finished portrait also hides the more difficult side of the artist's life. It does not show the contract, the unpaid balance, the pigment bill, the guild regulation, the cost of wood, the assistant waiting for wages, the argument over whether the blue was fine enough, or the uncomfortable moment when a patron delayed payment because he found some small fault. For all the dignity portraits gave to sitters, the artists who made them still lived inside a trade with rules, debts, materials, and practical risks. And those pressures lead us back from the polished face on the wall to the less polished paperwork and substances beneath it, where art was counted, priced, regulated, and sometimes left unpaid. Come back from the polished face on the wall and look down for a moment at the things the portrait does not show. The scraped wooden table, the account book, the unpaid bill for pigment, the apprentice who needs feeding, the supplier who wants his money, the guild rule that says who may work and under what conditions, the patron's promise that payment will come after the feast day, or after the next shipment arrives, or after his brother returns from Venice, or after the notary has drawn up the proper document. This is the less glamorous part of Renaissance art, but if we are trying to understand how artists actually made money, it may be the most important part of all. Because money did not simply appear when genius touched a brush. It moved through rules, contracts, shops, materials, credit, delay, negotiation, and sometimes resentment. The finished painting may look calm. The business behind it often was not. In most Renaissance cities, an artist was not simply free to open a door, hang a sign, and begin selling work as if the city were a modern marketplace. Trades were regulated. Skills were organised. Entry into professional life was shaped by guilds, apprenticeship, local custom, and the approval of people already inside the trade. In Florence, painters were attached to the Arte dei Medici Speziali, the guild of physicians, apothecaries, and spice merchants, partly because apothecaries and spice dealers supplied pigments and other materials painters used. Goldsmiths belonged with silk workers in the Arte della Seta, while sculptors and carpenters belonged to the Guild of Masters of Stone and Wood. That sounds strange until you remember what a painter's shop actually contained. Powders, minerals, gums, glues, oils, resins, prepared surfaces, and substances that had to be bought from people who understood trade in materials. A painter was not only a maker of images, he was a customer of the material economy. The guild mattered because it controlled access. It could limit outside competition, set standards of quality, regulate apprenticeship, and define who had the right to practice a trade within the city. Guilds in Europe had long controlled trades and professions, and membership was often compulsory for those who wanted to work legally in a city and its surrounding territory. To us, this can feel restrictive. To them, it was part of civic order. The guild protected customers from bad work, protected members from unfair competition, provided social and religious belonging, and maintained the dignity of the profession. It could also make life difficult for anyone outside the proper channels. Talent alone was not enough. You needed training, recognition, and the right to operate. Imagine a young man who has finished his apprenticeship. He has learned to draw. He can grind pigment, prepare panels, help with drapery, paint secondary figures, and perhaps handle a small commission. He wants to become a master. But becoming a master is not just a matter of feeling ready. In many settings, he must satisfy the guild, pay fees, present work, and prove that he can run a shop. Even after that, he may not have enough money to open one. A new master might continue working for wages in an older shop, enter a temporary partnership, or accept minor commissions until he can afford the tools, space, materials, and reputation required to stand alone. The workshop may appear to be a creative place, but it is also a financial threshold. To have your own shop means rent, workers, obligations, taxes, materials, and risk. This is one of those moments where the Renaissance artist becomes much less like the isolated genius of our imagination and much more like a small business owner under pressure. A successful master had to negotiate sales, assess materials, train apprentices, pay bills, supervise workers, and keep the shop functioning, while younger apprentices did the raw preparation and salaried assistants helped execute commissioned works. A painter who could draw beautifully but could not manage money might still fail. A sculptor with extraordinary skill but poor judgment about costs might find himself trapped by a commission that ate more than it paid. A shop needed cash flow. It needed trust. It needed a reputation for delivering work. It needed the right people doing the right tasks without wasting expensive material. Art was not separate from management. It depended on it. Now set that beside the contract. This is where the patron's desire becomes written obligation. A contract could specify the subject of the work, the size, the materials, the deadline, the payment schedule, and sometimes the parts that had to be done by the master's own hand. A patron might insist on particular colours, particular saints, particular gold, particular dimensions, or a specific level of finish. Researchers studying Renaissance art contracts have argued that these documents developed in part because both sides faced risk. The patron feared delay, poor quality, substitution of materials or non-delivery, while the artist feared non-payment, changing demands and costs that could rise before the work was finished. The contract did not remove mistrust. It gave mistrust a form. Picture the notary writing it down. The artist stands there, perhaps with a patron, perhaps with representatives of a church or guild. The words are careful. The panel must be completed by a certain feast day. The Virgin must be clothed in a certain quality of blue. The frame must be gilded. The work must be judged by experienced painters if there is disagreement. Payment will be made in parts. So much at the signing. So much when the work reaches a certain stage. So much after completion. Everyone understands that beauty is being planned, but the planning sounds like business because it is business. The saints have names, the colours have prices, the deadline has consequences. A contract could protect the artist too. If the patron later complained that he had wanted something else, the written agreement could answer him. If the patron delayed payment, the contract could become evidence. If a family member died and heirs tried to change the terms, the document mattered. But the protection was imperfect. A patron with more power could still delay, pressure, renegotiate, or make life unpleasant. An artist might be legally right and still practically weak. Going to court takes time. Angering a powerful family can damage future work. Accepting a reduced payment might be humiliating, but sometimes it keeps the relationship alive. The artist's problem was not simply whether he was owed money. It was whether collecting that money would cost him more than he gained. Then there were the materials, and here the money becomes physical. Pigments were not abstract colours selected from a tube. They were substances acquired through trade, mining, manufacture, and preparation. A Renaissance palette might include earth colours, lead white, vermilion, red lead, red lakes, verdigris, azurite, ultramarine, malachite, green earth, carbon black, bone black, and many other materials depending on region, date, and technique. Scientific studies of 15th and 16th century paintings have identified familiar pigments such as verdigris for greens, azurite and ultramarine for blues, vermilion, red lead, and red lakes for reds, along with additives used to modify the behaviour of paint. To the patron, the blue on the Virgin's mantle might mean honour. To the painter, it meant cost, supply, and care. Ultramarine was the famous example because it was made from lapis lazuli, a stone that had to travel from far away, most famously from mines in Afghanistan, through long trade routes before it reached Italian workshops. It was prized for its depth and durability, and because of its cost it could carry devotional and social meaning. But ultramarine also created risk. If the patron paid for it, he wanted to see it used. If the artist agreed to use it, he had to buy it. If payment was delayed, the pigment itself could become a financial strain. Cheaper blues existed, especially azurite, but substitution could be dangerous if the contract or patron expected the finer material. A blue robe could therefore become an argument in colour. Did the artist use enough? Was it the right quality? Was it applied where promised? Was the patron being cheated? Or was the patron asking for luxury without paying enough to cover it? Gold worked in a similar way. Gold leaf on an altarpiece was not just decoration. It caught candlelight, signalled sacred value, and helped the work function visually in a dim church. But gold had to be bought, handled, and applied with skill. It could be specified in agreements. It could raise the cost of the project. It could also raise the prestige of the commission. If a family chapel glittered properly, people noticed. If the gold was thin, dull, or poorly handled, they noticed that too. In a society where public appearance mattered, material quality could speak almost as loudly as the image itself. The artist's account book, if we could sit beside it for an evening, would tell a very different story from the museum wall. It would list small purchases, partial payments, debts owed, debts due, money advanced to assistants, costs for wood, glue, plaster, oil, pigment, gold, tools, transport, food, rent, and perhaps clothing for apprentices. Some money came in large payments from patrons. Much of it went out in smaller streams. A painter might receive an advance and immediately spend a large part of it on materials before any visible progress existed. If the patron visited too early, he might see only prepared panels and drawings, not realizing that part of his money had already disappeared into the basic conditions that made painting possible. This could lead to suspicion. Patrons sometimes thought artists were slow because they were lazy, distracted, or taking on too many jobs. Artists often knew the delay came from practical obstacles. A wall not ready, pigment not delivered, assistants unavailable, another urgent commission interfering, sickness in the household, a payment not received. Both sides had reasons to worry. The patron worried that the artist might skimp on effort once the price was agreed. The artist worried that the patron would keep adding demands without increasing payment. A portrait study from Harvard's Kennedy School describes the artist-patron relationship as one between principal and agent, with risks that the work might be delayed, not delivered, turn out poorly, or damage reputation if it violated expectations. That language is modern, but the problem is old. The person who pays and the person who makes do not carry the same risk in the same way. Now imagine the most uncomfortable version of this. The work is finished. The painting has left the shop. It has been carried carefully through the streets, perhaps covered, perhaps accompanied by assistants. It is installed in a chapel, a palace, a guild hall, or a private home. The patron looks at it. Others look at it. The artist waits, and then the patron hesitates. Perhaps he says the likeness is not good enough. Perhaps he says the work is late. Perhaps he says the gold is not as fine as promised. Perhaps he says the composition differs from the agreement. Perhaps he simply says money is short and the balance must wait. The artist smiles because he has to. Behind him stand assistants who expect wages and suppliers who are not interested in the patron's hesitation. Unpaid or delayed payment was not a minor irritation. It could damage the workshop. A master who was owed money might still owe money to others. The debt chain extended outward. The pigment seller wanted payment. The woodworker wanted payment. The gilder wanted payment. The assistants wanted wages. Apprentices needed food. If one large patron delayed, the master might have to borrow, postpone wages, accept another commission too quickly, or sell something. Financial pressure could shape artistic decisions in quiet ways. A shop under strain might take cheaper work, rush a job, reuse designs, or accept conditions it would otherwise reject. When we look only at the finished masterpiece, we miss the way delay could press on the hand. Michelangelo's long struggle over the tomb of Pope Julius II shows how even the most famous artists could be pulled into payment, contract, and patronage conflict. Julius II commissioned the tomb in 1505, but the project was repeatedly interrupted and reduced. In 1506, funds intended for the tomb were redirected toward the rebuilding of St. Peter's, and Michelangelo reacted by closing his studio, abandoning marble, and leaving Rome in anger. This was not an obscure craftsman being mistreated in silence. This was Michelangelo. And still the system could trap him. The tomb became a decades-long frustration, tangled in changing papal priorities, heirs, revised agreements, and accusations. If a man of Michelangelo's stature could spend years struggling with obligations and disputes, then imagine how much more vulnerable lesser-known artists could be. There is a temptation to make Michelangelo into an exception and leave him there, because his personality was large and his career unusual. But the underlying problem was not unusual. A major commission could become a burden if the patron died, changed priorities, ran out of money, lost power, or demanded revisions. A pope could redirect funds, a duke could be overthrown, a merchant could fail, a widow could dispute the cost, heirs could argue that the original patron had promised too much. Political upheaval could turn a once prestigious image into a liability. The artist's labour was always tied to other people's stability, and other people were not stable. The guild did not solve this either. The guild could regulate entry and standards, but it could not make every patron honest or every commission profitable. It could offer networks, identity, and sometimes mechanisms for judgment. Yet daily business still depended on trust and bargaining. If there was a dispute over quality, other artists might be asked to evaluate the work. That sounds fair, but it could be awkward. Rivals judged rivals. Standards could be subjective. A patron who disliked the outcome might seek a lower price. An artist who felt insulted might defend his honour as fiercely as his fee. Reputation and money were tied together, so a dispute was never only financial. It could become a public judgment on competence. Then there was the question of who actually made the work. Contracts sometimes tried to ensure that the master himself completed important parts, because patrons knew that workshop production involved assistants. This created another business tension. The master's name sold the commission, but the shop's labour made it possible. If the master personally painted every inch, output slowed and income shrank. If assistants did too much, the patron might complain. The contract became a way to manage this invisible division of labour. Perhaps the master must paint the faces and hands. Perhaps the assistants can do backgrounds. Perhaps the master must design everything and finish the most visible parts. The patron wanted the master's touch. The master needed the workshop's hands. This is where the cost of skill becomes hard to measure. How much is the master's hand worth compared with an assistant's? How much should a patron pay for invention rather than execution? How much of a painting's value lies in the design, and how much in the surface? Renaissance people argued over these questions in practice, even if not always in modern terms. When a patron hired a famous workshop, he might receive a work that was partly by the master, partly by assistants, and fully under the shop's style. That could be acceptable if everyone understood the arrangement. It could become trouble if expectations differed. The rise of the artist's status made this tension sharper. Earlier in the Renaissance, many painters were still treated primarily as craftsmen, artigiani, grouped with trades and manual skills. Over time, especially through claims about design, invention, mathematics, anatomy, and intellectual judgment, artists increasingly argued that painting and sculpture belonged closer to the liberal arts than to ordinary manual labour. The National Gallery of Art's Renaissance resources note that while workshop training continued, artists increasingly saw themselves as practitioners of a liberal art, and new institutions reflected that transformation. That change mattered for money. A craftsman is paid for labour. A celebrated artist can ask to be paid for mind, fame, and invention. The same brushstroke costs more when the name attached to it has become valuable. But that new status did not arrive evenly or peacefully. A painter still had to buy pigment from suppliers. A sculptor still had to pay for marble transport. A goldsmith still had to handle precious metal under strict expectations. An architect still had to satisfy patrons, builders, and budgets. The rhetoric of genius could rise while the practical burdens remained. This is part of what makes the Renaissance so interesting. It is a period when artists begin to push upward socially, yet many of their working conditions remain tied to shop labour, guild regulation, and client control. They are becoming more than craftsmen in reputation, but they are not free from the structures of craft. Consider the pigment seller for a moment. He is not famous. No one will put his name beside the painting. But if he supplies poor material, the work suffers. If he extends credit, he becomes part of the artist's financial life. If he refuses credit, the artist may have to delay. The same is true of carpenters who prepare panels, frame makers, gold beaters, stone suppliers, quarrymen, transporters, and tool makers. A Renaissance artwork often depended on a chain of people whose names have vanished. The artist is the visible centre, but he is not the whole economy. Behind every finished object is a network of trades. This network could be fragile. A shipment of good pigment might be late. The price of materials might rise. A war could interrupt trade. A disease outbreak could slow work or kill patrons. Political changes could shift commissions from one city to another. A patron's disgrace could make a nearly finished work dangerous to display. A family feud could stop payment. A church reform movement could change attitudes towards certain images. Even weather could matter if fresco work depended on plaster and timing, or if transport of marble and panels was difficult. The artist's income was exposed to far more than personal talent. There is also the problem of credit. Many Renaissance transactions did not happen as simple cash payments made cleanly at the end of a job. Payments could be staged, delayed, offset, or made through complicated arrangements. An artist might owe money while being owed money. He might accept partial payment in goods, favours, or promises depending on circumstances. Account books from the period often reveal a world of small entries rather than dramatic bags of coins. This is important because it changes the emotional life of the workshop. A commission worth a respectable sum on paper might still cause anxiety if the money arrives slowly. Profit on paper does not feed apprentices tonight. And then there were artists who were simply bad at business, or too ambitious, or too proud, or too trusting. A painter might agree to too low a price because he wanted the commission. A sculptor might underestimate the time required. A young master might spend heavily on materials to impress a patron and then find the margin gone. A famous artist might delay because he had too many offers and not enough discipline. A patron might forgive a delay from a genius that he would not forgive from an ordinary master. Reputation could bend the rules, but it could also invite greater demands. If people think you are extraordinary, they may ask you to do impossible things and then complain when they take time. This is the daily reality hidden beneath the word masterpiece. Masterpieces did not come from a world where everyone behaved fairly and paid on time. They came from a world where artists worked inside pressure. Some were protected by strong patrons. Some were trapped by strong patrons. Some used contracts to defend themselves. Some were undone by them. Some built thriving shops. Some drifted from job to job. Some became court favourites. Some remained local craftsmen. Some were paid in ways that made them wealthy. Others made objects we now admire while living under constant uncertainty. If you look again at a Renaissance painting after knowing this, the surface becomes busier. The blue mantle is not only blue, it is a purchase, a promise, perhaps a line in a contract. The gold is not only light, it is a material decision and a patron statement. The careful hand of a saint may be the master's own because the patron required it. The background may carry an assistant's labour. The frame may speak of another workshop entirely. The date may hide delays. The polished finish may hide an argument. The signature, if there is one, may hide a whole shop behind a single name. There is something almost comforting in this, though not because the system was fair. It often was not. It is comforting because it makes the art more human. The Renaissance did not produce beauty by escaping ordinary life. It produced beauty through ordinary life, through bills, rules, apprenticeships, negotiations, suppliers, contracts, mistakes, pride, debt, and the stubborn need to keep working. The artist's imagination had to pass through all of that. A painting was not made in spite of the workshop economy, it was made by it. And yet, amid all this paperwork and pigment dust, something began to change. The more certain artists succeeded, the more their name started to matter beyond the immediate object. A patron might not ask only for a good painting. He might ask for a Leonardo, a Raphael, a Titian, a Michelangelo. The name itself began to carry value. The hand became famous. The fame became negotiable. The negotiable fame became money. That change did not erase guilds, contracts, pigments, or debts, but it altered the balance between artist and patron in ways that would shape the future of art long after the Renaissance workshop closed its shutters for the night. By the time a painter's name began to matter on its own, something very important had shifted. Not all at once, not everywhere, not cleanly, but slowly enough that people living through it may not have noticed the full change until it had already happened. For centuries, images had been made for churches, courts, houses, guilds, monasteries and public spaces, and the object itself had often mattered more than the person who made it. A crucifix needed to move the heart, an altarpiece needed to honour a saint, a tomb needed to preserve status and memory, a banner needed to lead a procession. The maker mattered, of course, especially to the people who paid him, but he did not always matter in the way he would later matter. By the High Renaissance, that older world had not disappeared, but another layer had settled over it. Patrons were not simply asking for a painting anymore. Some were asking for a Raphael, a Titian, a Michelangelo, a Leonardo, a Dürer. A name could now travel ahead of the work, and once a name could do that, it could become money. This is one of the most important and strange developments in the whole story. A workshop could make objects. A contract could define materials. A patron could pay for size, gold, blue pigment, number of figures, delivery date, frame and placement. But fame added something that could not be measured with a ruler or weighed like lapis lazuli. Fame made the same kind of work cost more because of who made it. A portrait by an ordinary competent painter might satisfy a family. A portrait by a celebrated master could become a possession that proved the family had access to greatness. The image still had to look right. The face still had to resemble the sitter. The saint still had to be recognisable. But now the signature, the style, the hand, the reputation, and the story around the artist all began to change the value of the object. Imagine a patron standing in a finished room showing a guest a painting. There are many things he could say. He could say, "This is my wife. This is my father. This is St. Jerome. This is the Madonna for our chapel." But there is another sentence that starts to matter more and more. This is by Raphael. This is by Titian. This is by Leonardo. That sentence does social work. It tells the guest that the owner had taste, money, access, and judgment. It says that the patron was not merely able to pay for colour on wood or canvas, but able to command the attention of someone whose name had become desirable. The artist's fame therefore served the patron's fame. That is one reason patrons were willing to pay for it. For the artist, this was a powerful change, but also a dangerous one. A famous name could bring higher fees, more offers, court invitations, gifts, protection, and room to negotiate. It could also bring impossible expectations. The more famous an artist became, the more people wanted not only his work but his presence, his promise, his personal hand, and his confirmation that they were important enough to deserve him. A lesser artist might be judged on whether the painting was good. A famous artist might be judged on whether the painting was worthy of the name already attached to him before he began. Fame created value, but it also created pressure. Think of Michelangelo. He is one of the clearest examples because his fame grew during his own lifetime to a level that was unusual even in an age of ambitious artists. He was not merely a man who made statues and paintings. He became a figure people argued about, admired, pursued, resented, and discussed. Patrons wanted him because his work carried force, but also because his name carried force. A commission from him could elevate a patron's project. If Michelangelo worked on your tomb, your chapel, your facade, your statue, then the project stood closer to history before it was even finished. That did not mean he had an easy life. In many ways, it made his working life more complicated. The more important the artist, the larger the quarrels that could form around him. The unfinished tomb of Julius II, the demands of papal service, the long strain of major commissions, the constant expectation that he produced something beyond ordinary skill, all of this shows that fame did not free him from the patronage system. It changed the terms of the struggle. Leonardo's fame worked differently. He left fewer finished works than many people assume, and yet his name became extraordinary because of the range of his mind, the mystery of his unfinished projects, the reputation of his drawings, and the fascination he inspired in courts and later writers. This is an important point. Fame was not always tied to steady output. Sometimes scarcity made the name stronger. A painter who completed many works could become desirable because he was reliable, productive, and recognizable. Another artist might become desirable because he seemed almost impossible to secure. A patron who could obtain a work from a difficult or elusive master gained not only the object but the story of having obtained it. This is where art begins to move closer to the world of collecting. A patron might want an image for a chapel because the chapel needed decoration. He might want a portrait because a marriage required one. But a collector could want a work because of the artist. Drawings, small paintings, studies, antiquities, sculptures, medals, and rare objects entered rooms where they were admired, compared, discussed, and used as evidence of learning. The Renaissance court or humanist study could become a place where owning the right object mattered because it placed the owner inside a culture of taste. And once collecting became more self-conscious, the artist's name became even more useful. It helped organize desire. It helped people know what to seek. There is something almost modern about that. We still do it. We stand in a museum and move toward the famous name. We may not mean to. We may admire unknown painters too, but the famous name pulls at us. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian. Botticelli, Dürer. Their names arrive before the picture does. We look harder because we have been told the name matters. Renaissance patrons began to understand the same thing in their own way. A name could gather attention around an object. A name could make ownership meaningful. A name could turn a painting into a statement before anyone even judged the paint. Signatures played into this. Those signatures were never the whole story. Some artists signed works earlier than the Renaissance, and not every Renaissance artist signed regularly. But during this period, the identity of the maker became increasingly visible and important. A signature could function as a claim. It could say, this came from this hand, this mind, this shop, this reputation. In Northern Europe, Albrecht Dürer understood the power of the mark with unusual clarity. His monogram, those interlocked letters, became one of the most recognisable artist signs of the period. It appeared on prints that could travel far more widely than a single painting. That mattered enormously. Prints changed the economics of fame because they allowed an image, and with it an artist's name, to move through markets at a different scale. A painted altarpiece usually stayed where it was installed. A fresco could not travel at all. A portrait might travel, but it was unique and limited. A print could be multiplied. It could cross borders. It could reach buyers who would never commission a large painting. It could carry the artist's style into homes, workshops, collections, and cities far from the place where it was made. Dürer's fame was tied deeply to this world of reproducible images. His prints allowed his invention to circulate, and circulation helped turn his name into a kind of commercial force. This did not make him a modern celebrity in the full sense, but it brought him closer to something we recognise. A name attached to widely distributed works, a mark that people could seek, a style that could be recognised, copied, admired, and sold. Prints also created problems that are still familiar. If a name becomes valuable, others may imitate it. If a style sells, others may borrow it. If a monogram gives authority, it must be protected. The money value of fame produces the shadow of copying and forgery. This was not just a later problem invented by modern auction houses. Once an artist's identity mattered in the market, the question of authenticity became more important. Was the work by the master, from the workshop, after the master, copied from a print, inspired by a design, finished by assistants? These distinctions mattered because they affected value. The closer the object seemed to stand to the famous hand, the more desirable it could become. That is a remarkable development when you think about it. Earlier in our story, a patron might have worried whether the expensive blue was real or whether the gold was good enough. Now a buyer might also worry whether the hand was real. The material still mattered, but the identity of the maker had become a material of its own. The famous hand became almost like a costly pigment, not visible in the same way, not something you could grind in a bowl, but something that altered the price. Writers helped this process. Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, first published in the middle of the 16th century and expanded later, was one of the most important texts in creating the story of Renaissance artists as individual personalities with careers, styles, rivalries, talents, flaws, and destinies. Vasari did not invent artistic fame by himself, but he gave it narrative shape. He told stories, he arranged lives, he praised progress, he turned artists into characters. He helped later generations imagine the Renaissance as a sequence of great men whose genius could be described, compared, and remembered. This mattered for money too, even if not always immediately. Once artists have biographies, they become more than suppliers of images. They become historical figures. Their early works, late works, unfinished works, drawings, and even failures can become interesting because they belong to the story of a life. The artist's life itself became part of value. Where did he train? Whose workshop formed him? Which patrons employed him? Did he work in Florence, Rome, Venice, Milan, Nuremberg? Did he serve a pope, a duke, a king, a republic? Did he quarrel? Did he leave works unfinished? Did he die young? Did he change style? Did Did he have students? Did he influence others? These questions sound like art history now, but they are also market questions. A painting gains meaning if it is placed at the right point in a famous career. A drawing becomes more desirable if it shows the hand thinking. A work from a celebrated period may be prized over another. Fame organizes value by organizing attention. Raphael shows another side of this. He died young, and that fact became part of the aura around him. During his lifetime, he built a large and efficient workshop, especially in Rome, and his ability to produce major projects depended on organization as well as talent. After his death, his designs, students, and style continued to matter. This is a perfect example of how a name can extend beyond a body. The artist dies, but the workshop memory remains. Students carry methods forward. Drawings circulate, copies are made. Patrons continue to desire the kind of grace associated with the name. Fame does not stop when the hand stops moving. In some cases, death makes it stronger because the supply is now fixed. No more new works can be made by the master. Scarcity enters the room. Titian offers yet another path. He lived long, served powerful patrons, worked for courts, and maintained a reputation that allowed him to negotiate from a position of unusual strength. A long career can make fame heavy in a different way. The artist becomes associated with decades of service, portraits of rulers, mythological paintings, religious works, and a recognizable handling of colour and surface. The name becomes dependable but still prestigious. A patron who obtains Titian is not simply buying a painting. He's buying a connection to a painter already linked with emperors, princes, and the highest levels of power. In that sense, fame compounds. Important patrons raise the artist's status. The artist's status then raises the prestige of later patrons who hire him. This is why networks mattered so much. Fame did not drift through the air by itself. It moved through patrons, letters, gifts, court visits, diplomatic exchanges, prints, drawings, students, gossip, church visibility, and written praise. A work seen in the right place by the right person could matter more than a better work hidden in a private room. A court recommendation could bring another court commission. A portrait of a ruler could create demand for copies. A praised chapel could bring new patrons to the workshop. A biography could preserve anecdotes that made later collectors care. Fame was not only talent recognized, it was talent distributed through systems of communication. The artist's name also changed the relationship with time. Ordinary commissions were often tied to immediate needs. A chapel needed decorating. A marriage needed marking. A guild needed a banner. But a famous artist's work could be valued beyond its first use. A drawing might be saved. A study might be collected. A half-finished work might be kept because the hand mattered even without completion. That is a major shift. In a purely functional economy, an unfinished work is a failure. In a fame economy, an unfinished work by a great name can become fascinating. It lets the viewer see process, thought, struggle, possibility. The artist's touch becomes valuable, even when the original practical purpose is incomplete. This may be one of the clearest signs that the artist's status had changed. The workshop world still cared about finished delivery. Patrons still wanted what they had paid for. But certain artists became interesting even in fragments. Their drawings, studies, cartoons, and unfinished surfaces attracted attention because people wanted contact with the mind behind the finished work. The drawing, once mainly a tool, could become a collectible object. The study could reveal invention. The sketch could feel intimate. And if drawings could be collected, then an artist's thinking could become part of the market. There is a quiet irony here. Earlier, the artist struggled to separate himself from ordinary manual labour, arguing through practice, theory, and social ambition that art required intellect, design, and judgment. Once that argument began to succeed, even the traces of thinking became valuable. A drawn line could be more than preparation. It could be evidence of genius. This did not mean every artist benefited equally. Most did not. The elevation of a few famous names often made the distance between celebrated masters and ordinary working artists even more obvious. But the idea had changed. A painter was no longer automatically just a man who coloured surfaces. At the top of the profession, he could be treated as a mind worth collecting. Self-presentation helped. Artists painted or drew themselves. They wrote letters. They cultivated patrons. They accepted court titles. They dressed and behaved in ways that signalled higher status when they could. Some wanted to be seen as gentlemen, not mere craftsmen. This mattered because social status affected money. If an artist could convince patrons that his work belonged among learned and noble pursuits, he could ask for more respect and sometimes more pay. He could resist being treated like a simple tradesman. He could claim that invention, not just labour, deserved reward. That claim did not always work, but when it did, it changed the negotiation. Still, fame did not mean freedom. Even the most celebrated artist remained vulnerable to power. A pope could command, a duke could delay payment, a court could demand presence, a patron could be offended, political change could turn favour into danger. Fame gave an artist leverage, but not independence in the modern sense. There was no simple path from talent to wealth. There were only better and worse positions inside systems of patronage, trade, court service, religion, and reputation. A famous artist might earn more, but he might also owe more, risk more, and be pulled into larger conflicts. For the ordinary artist, the rise of famous names could be both inspiring and troubling. On one hand, it raised the status of the profession. If Michelangelo could speak with popes, if Titian could work for emperors, if Dürer could be honoured across Europe, then painting and sculpture could no longer be dismissed as mere handwork in quite the old way. On the other hand, not every painter could be Michelangelo. Most still lived by local commissions, workshop labour, guild rules, modest portraits, decorative work, and difficult payments. The fame of a few did not erase the working reality of many. It may even have made clients more eager to demand famous quality at ordinary prices, which is a problem creative workers would recognise immediately. And yet something had been set loose. The artist's name could now survive in a new way. It could be written by biographers. It could be requested by patrons. It could be recognised in prints. It could be copied by followers. It could be argued over by collectors. It could alter price. It could outlive the workshop, the apprentices, the original contract, the patron's family, and sometimes the building for which the work was first made. A name became a kind of vessel carrying style, reputation, personality, and value forward. Think about what that means for the artists we've been following through this whole story. The boy who once swept the shop floor might dream not only of earning a living, but of having his own name known. The assistant painting drapery might hope one day that patrons would ask for him personally. The master negotiating over pigment might understand that if this public commission succeeds, it could make future negotiations easier. The court painter might know that each royal portrait strengthens his association with power. The printmaker might see his monogram carried across borders. The sculptor might realise that marble is not the only thing being carved. Reputation is being carved too, slowly through work, praise, dispute, visibility and memory. There is something deeply human in this. The patrons wanted to be remembered. The artist did too. That is one of the quiet connections between them. A merchant paid for a chapel so that his name would remain. A ruler paid for portraits so that his authority would travel beyond his body. A bride's family paid for an image so that alliance and status would be secured. A guild paid for a saint so that its place in the city would be visible. And the artist, who made all these forms of memory for others, gradually found ways to leave his own memory attached to the work. The signature, the style, the biography, the pupil, the copied design, the praised fresco, the print, the story that survives. So when you stand in front of a Renaissance painting now, try to hold both things at once. The image is there, with its colour, surface, composition and stillness. But behind it is the workshop and the contract, The patron and the payment, the expensive pigment, the assistant's labour, the apprentice's training, the guild's permission, the church's altar, the family's ambition, the sitter's anxiety, the unpaid debt, the delayed instalment, and finally the name that history chose to remember. We see the name first now, usually. It is printed on the museum wall, spoken in tours, placed on posters, used to organise rooms and guide attention. But in the beginning, that name had to earn its way into value. It had to pass through the door of a workshop, through the demands of patrons, through the routines of labour, through the judgment of viewers, and through the uncertain machinery of money. That is what makes the Renaissance artist's career so much more interesting than the clean story of genius alone. Genius mattered. Of course it did. Skill mattered. Invention mattered. The ability to make flesh appear warm, cloth appear heavy, space appear deep, grief appear human, power appear natural, and heaven appear close, all of that mattered. But genius without work did not pay the rent. Genius without patrons did not fill chapels. Genius without materials did not become colour. Genius without reputation did not command higher fees. Genius without survival could disappear before anyone knew what it was. By the end of the Renaissance, the old workshop world was still there, still full of boys grinding pigment, assistants painting secondary figures, masters arguing over payment, and patrons asking for more than they wished to pay for. But above that world, or perhaps growing out of it, was the modern idea of the artist beginning to take shape, the artist as named individual, the artist as mind, the artist as personality. The artist as someone whose life could be written, whose drawings could be collected, whose unfinished works could be valued, whose signature could matter, whose name could raise the price of a painting before the painting had even been seen. And that, in the end, is how artists actually made money in the Renaissance. Not in one way, but in many overlapping ways. They made money from patrons who needed devotion turned into image. They made money from churches that needed altars, chapels, saints, tombs, and visual teaching. They made money from merchants and rulers who wanted faces preserved and power made visible. They made money through workshops that organised labour and multiplied style. They made money under guild rules through contracts with costly pigments and complicated debts. And for the most successful few, they made money because their names became valuable in themselves. The next time you see a Renaissance painting glowing under museum lights, it may be worth imagining it differently for a moment. Not as a silent miracle floating outside ordinary life, but as the final surface of a very human arrangement. Someone wanted to be remembered. Someone wanted to be forgiven. Someone wanted to look powerful. Someone wanted a chapel to speak after death. Someone wanted a daughter married, a ruler honoured, a saint praised, a city impressed. Someone mixed the glue. Someone ground the blue. Someone waited for money. Someone corrected a young assistant's mistake. Someone signed a name, or did not, and hoped the work would lead to more work. Then the years passed. The patron died. The workshop emptied. The account books were lost. The debts were forgotten. The building changed. The painting survived. And now we look at it and say the artist's name first.